This was all Absalom's doing, of course. This was all Absalom's doing, of course.
这是亚撒龙所做的。
Try this again. This was all Absalom's doing, of course.
这是亚撒龙所做的。
Not that this was the first time King David had been running for his life.
这不是第一次大卫王逃跑，为求生而逃跑。
During the 10 years that he'd run from Saul, he almost got used to being in danger every day.
在他那10年逃离扫的时候，他基本上已经习惯了这种每天逃离的生活。
But this was different.
但是这一次是不一样的。
This time it was his good-for-nothing son that was out to kill him.
这一次跟上一次不一样，跟扫罗要杀他。
But I can't help but imagine that David also felt a little guilty that day too.
但是呢，我会想那一天大卫同时他自己也感到有一些心里有罪。
He knew that part of the responsibility was his.
因为他知道这其中部分的原因是他自己。
He had failed abysmally both as a husband and a father.
因为他违背了他的父亲。
And he knew that God had told him that it was because of his actions that his whole family was falling apart.
而且上帝已经很明确告诉他，是因为他所做所行的，所以他的家庭才四分五裂。
But though Absalom was technically the cause of all of this, that really wasn't the wound that cut deepest.
但是亚撒龙肯定也是这事件的一部分。
He really could not be angry with Absalom. Absalom was his own son.
他不可能不对亚撒龙有生气，因为是他自己的儿子。
So in spite of everything, he still loved him.
尽管发生这么多事情，但是他依然很爱他。
No, it was somebody else, somebody who joined Absalom, that was the greater shock.
但是令人更奇怪的是，有人也加入了亚撒龙的这个行列，让他更震惊。
Ahithophel of all people.
亚希多弗是他的人。
Ahithophel's counsel was famously wise, and now he had joined with Absalom.
亚希多弗是他的神谕大卫的一个谋士，然后他现在也加入了亚撒龙。
But perhaps here too, a reason for all of this stemmed all the way back to David.
所以可能因为这所有的一切，很多都让大卫感到不能忍受。
There's enough evidence to guess that Ahithophel was probably Bathsheba's grandfather.
另外还有一个原因就是这个亚希多弗他是拔示巴的祖父。
There's a couple of obscure passages that indicate that this was most likely the case.
在圣经里面有一些经节曾经讲到，这可能是真的。
In fact, if later you want to look up 2 Samuel 15, or 2 Samuel 23:34 and 2 Samuel 11:3, you'll see where I got that conclusion.
我们稍后会看一下撒母耳记15章12节和11章3节的经节，你就会知道我们讲什么。
Well, in this story that I've told you somewhat imaginatively is my best guess of the situation that underlies the psalm we're going to be talking about today.
我刚刚讲的这个故事，就给大家暗示了这讲的故事这个背景，为我们的今天的故事陈述一个完整的背景。
Psalm 41 is a psalm of David.
诗篇41章是大卫的诗篇。
And David walks us through a time when he's evaluating his condition because of the difficulties he's experiencing.
大卫在这章里面跟我们向我们讲述他当时所经历的这个困难的环境。
There are a few places to go in the Bible, as comforting as the Psalms, when you are experiencing difficulty in your life.
在圣经里面在诗篇有好多章节，都是可以在我们困境的时候可以给我们安慰。
And especially the Psalms of David.
特别是这个大卫的诗篇。
For David went through suffering and difficulty in his life on a scale that is hard for most of us to even imagine.
大卫曾经经历了很多困难的时光，这些很多困难的环境是我们常人所不能想象的。
And in his Psalms, he passionately tells God exactly how he feels about God.
而在这些痛苦时光当中，他曾经向上帝诉说了他当时所感受的。
Well, this psalm is one psalm like that.
这个诗篇就是这样的一个诗篇。
He evaluates himself. He invites us to ask 4 questions to evaluate our spiritual condition.
他邀请我们来问4个问题，这样我们可以来检测我们自己的一个心灵的一个状况。
He invites us to first investigate our integrity.
那首先邀请我们来测试自己心里面的正直完整。
So, if you're with me in Psalm 41, in the first 3 verses, we will ask ourselves the question, how do we treat others?
所以如果你们在听我讲到的话，你看这个诗篇41章第1节到第3节就讲到我们是怎么对待别人。
Like many psalms, we find what might seem to be a rapid change in mood as we go through this.
就像在很多诗篇中，我们会发现，在这个里面也是一样，他的感情是有大的起伏的。
We start with this confident, cheerful statement of wisdom that explains what God does for those who consider the poor.
他的这个诗篇开始以这种很欢喜的心情讲到上帝对这种贫穷的人他们是怎么做的。
In the middle, we change to this cry for help in suffering.
然后在这诗篇中间，他有哭诉，然后讲到他的困苦。
Where he describes vividly just how his enemies make him feel.
然后他很形象地描述他的敌人让他感受的心情是怎么样的。
But in the end, we end on this high note of praise toward God.
然后在这篇的结束，他又很高调的来赞美上帝。
But the first question he asks, how do we treat others? We find it in Psalm 41, verses 1 to 3.
首先他在问我们是怎么对待别人的，在诗篇41章第1到3节讲的。
He says, "Blessed is the one who considers the poor. In the day of trouble, the Lord delivers him. The Lord protects him and keeps him alive. He is called blessed in the land. You do not give him up to the will of his enemies. The Lord sustains him on his sickbed. In his illness, you restore him to full health."
1到3节讲到眷顾贫穷的有福，他遭难的日子，耶和华必搭救他，耶和华必保全他，使他存活，他必在地上享福。求你不要把他交给仇敌，遂其所愿。他病重在榻，耶和华必扶持他。他在病中，你必给他铺床。
Now David declares that the one who considers the poor is blessed, but who are the poor?
大卫指出，被赐福的他们有眷顾贫穷有福，但是谁是这些贫穷的人呢？
Now, of course, immediately you think of those who are economically poor, those who lack the ability to buy, say, food or clothing that they need.
我们肯定会马上想到那些在经济上穷的人，那些人买不起吃的、没有穿的人。
And certainly the Hebrew word very often means exactly what you would think it means.
而且在希伯来语当中，这个贫穷也就很多时候就是指这样的人。
But it's used for more kinds of poverty than just not enough money in your bank account.
但实际上在这里的意思，它并不是讲到这种贫穷，不是讲在 银行账户有多少钱这种贫穷。
It's also used for those who are physically weak. They don't lack money, they lack strength or health.
那么他也讲了一个在身体上的贫穷，不仅仅是希望在银行里更多一点钱，但是希望身体上很健康他们很强壮。
Sometimes it's used to describe what I guess you could sort of call socially poor.
有时候也会讲到那些在可能社交上有些缺乏的人。
Meaning they have no authority in society. They need to get something done, perhaps, but nobody pays any attention or respect to them.
有的人他们在社交上他们可能没有这些能力，他们想做一些事情，但是他们却没有人来帮助他们，他们也不能把这些事情来完成。
They're the sort of people that perhaps are easily taken advantage of because they have no recourse.
他们也是那种人，他们很容易被别人占便宜，因为他们没办法去报复别人。
And even sometimes it can speak of the emotionally depressed.
有的时候这种贫穷也是指在他们的精神上的一种压抑。
There is one case where this word for poor is used to describe a king's son.
在这里，这个贫穷这个单词在圣经里面有一次描述到，讲到这个王的儿子。
And he obviously didn't lack money, but in the context, he was clearly depressed.
因为他是王的儿子，所以他根本不缺钱，但是他在精神上他有抑郁，他也是一种贫穷。
So when David says, "Blessed are those who consider the poor," he means anyone who is suffering from any kind of difficulty.
所以当大卫说眷顾贫穷的人有福，那么他这里说的这个贫穷是任何有刚刚这些情形的人都可以称之为贫穷。
And what he tells us to do with the poor, to consider, that's not a normal word used in this context.
当他讲到这个贫穷的时候，不是我们所想这种意义上的贫穷。
Most often, it actually describes the wisdom or insight someone has into life.
通常他是要讲人们在心中的这个智慧。
So when David says, "Blessed is the one who considers the poor," he doesn't just mean someone who donated a few old clothes to Goodwill last week.
所以他在讲眷顾贫穷人有福，他并不是说眷顾那些去捐东西的人。
Not that I'm saying you shouldn't give clothes to Goodwill. That's not what I'm saying.
我也不是说不鼓励大家去捐衣服到二手店。
He means someone who sees someone in any kind of difficulty, whether economic or emotional or physical, and really understands what they're going through.
他是说那些人看到别人的贫穷，不仅仅是在精神上、身体上，而是在所有方面有需求的人去帮助人。
And of course, if you identify with them, you're going to do something about it.
如果你知道有这样的人，当然你会对这些人做一些事情来帮助他们。
David himself is a good example of this.
大卫他自己本身就是一个很好的例子。
He showed great mercy to Mephibosheth.
他曾经也对别人有很多怜悯。
Now, Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan, Saul's friend, or David's friend.
米非波设这个人是他的一个仆人的儿子。
He was, of course, also the grandson of King Saul, David's predecessor.
他也是扫罗王的儿子后裔。
It would have been quite common in the day to simply wipe out any descendants of the king you replaced.
当然大卫当他其实可以把以前的王的后代全部把他们除掉。
And after years of running from Saul, it would be easy for him to become bitter and want to do exactly that.
在他经历那么多年的逃亡，他其实很容易可以做这种事情。
But though Mephibosheth was descended from a king, he was in this circumstance extremely lacking in a great deal of power.
因为米非波设是以前的这个王的后代，实际上他这个时候是根本就没有什么力量来对抗大卫。
Saul's family now had no power at all, and it was David's family that had all the power.
他当时他们的力量是根本没办法和大卫的家庭的力量来对抗。
David wanted to show kindness to Mephibosheth.
但是呢，大卫想对米非波设呢表示他的怜恤，
So Mephibosheth brought in before him.
他让人把这米非波设带到他面前。
And just when Mephibosheth was expecting the worst, David grants him mercy.
当这个米非波设以为大卫会处罚他，但是却没料到大卫给他的怜恤。
He gives Mephibosheth all of Saul's ancestral lands.
他给了米非波设他祖先他所留下的那些地产。
Since, of course, Mephibosheth was just about the only descendant of Saul left living.
当然米非波设也是他们家里留下来的唯一的后裔。
And gave Mephibosheth, allowed him to eat at his table for the rest of his life.
而且他也让米非波设今后一直和他同桌吃饭。
So when David says those who consider the poor, he means an example like this.
所以当大卫说我们要眷顾贫穷的人，他是说到的是这样的情形。
So how do we do this?
所以我们应该怎么做呢？
Well, if you have some old clothes to give, go ahead and do it.
当然，如果你有一些旧的衣服不用的，你可以捐到二手店没问题。
But giving to the poor in the Bible is always personal.
但是眷顾贫穷的人在圣经当中，从来都是一个私人的问题。
Where you personally see someone that a specific person you know needs help, and then you reach out and you help them.
他说的是你自己亲眼亲自看到有这么一个人，他有特别的需要。
That can be challenging in this wealthy land of ours. A lot of us really don't need anything.
反正在我们当今这个社会，我们什么都很富足的情况下，这个是很难做到的一件事情。
But we still suffer from sickness.
但是当然，我们还是会生病。
We still suffer. Sometimes something in our life comes that makes life difficult. We know about those.
我们知道我们在生活当中还是会碰到很多困难的事情。
So if someone is, perhaps they've been sick, or perhaps there's been a loss in the family, or something like that.
当然，如果我们看到周围有生病的人，或者周围有人他们失去亲人的时候，
Something simple as taking them a meal or visiting them in the hospital.
我们可以很简单，我们就送一顿饭，或者是到医院里面去看望他们这些生病的人。
Perhaps someone is simply depressed.
也许就有人他就是精神很抑郁、很忧郁。
You can come alongside them and encourage them.
你可以跟随他一块儿去鼓励他。
All of that is considering the poor.
所有这种情形都是被我们认为是贫穷的。
And then notice why David says the person who considers the poor is blessed.
为什么这个圣经里面会说眷顾贫穷的人他们有福了？
He effectively says that God preserves that person if he is sick or if he is in trouble.
因为这个圣经里面说，这种人耶和华会保全他，或者他生病的时候，或者他有祸的时候来扶持他。
That's a biblical principle that those who show mercy to others will find it themselves.
所以这个讲到这个道理，就是说，如果我们去怜悯他人，那么耶稣也会怜悯我们。
Matthew 5:7, Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy.
在马太福音5章7节，他说：“怜恤的人有福了，因他们必蒙怜恤。”
Luke 37 and 38, Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured again to you.
在路加福音6章37到38节。你们不要论断人，就不被论断；你们不要定人的罪，就不被定罪；你们要饶恕人，就必蒙饶恕；你们要给人，就必有给你们的； 并且用十足的伸手，连摇带按，上尖下流的到你们怀里，因为你们用什么量器量给人，也必用什么量器量给你们。
And then Galatians 6:7, do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that will he also reap.
加拉太书第6章7到第7节说：“不要自欺，神是轻慢不得的。人种的是什么，收的也是什么。”
So the biblical law of sowing and reaping applies, but we have to be careful here.
所以圣经里面说了，你种什么就会收什么。但是我们需要很小心。
Because you might read this thinking David is talking about some kind of earning merit or favor with God.
但是我们在要想看的是，因为这里我们大卫并不是说我们要做一些喜悦上帝的事情。
It almost reads like, well, I'll do something for God and then God does something for me, that kind of thing.
然后就是并不是说，如果我们为上帝做一个事情，上帝就一定会为我们做一个事情，互相回报。
But that, I don't think, is what David means.
但这并不是大卫所要说的。
Because in verse 4, he admits that he sinned.
因为在第4节，他承认了他自己有罪。
In fact, he implies that all of these circumstances are the result of his sin.
而且他自己也承认了，他所有这些受罪的情形，都是因为他犯罪。
He may have run from Saul for years, but that wasn't his fault. It was nothing he did.
他曾经逃避扫罗很多年，但这并不是他的错误。
This circumstance, whatever it might be, is his fault. It's because he sinned.
但是他现在所做的情形，确实是他的错误，是因为他做的事情而导致的结果。
So, if this circumstance is his fault, he's certainly not suggesting that we do something for God, God will do something for us.
所以这件事情如果是因为他自己所做的事情而导致的，那么他肯定并不是说，如果我们为上帝做了什么事情，上帝也一定会为我们来做什么事情。
Rather, what he is saying is that your actions reflect the faith that you have.
而他其实说的是，他说你所做的行为呢，反映出了你对上帝的信心的程度。
Our good works show people what's on the inside.
我们所做的好的事情，向人们表明我们心里面所信的东西。
This is why James says in James chapter 2, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead.
这也是为什么在圣经雅各书第2章14到17节说：“我的弟兄们，有人说自己是有信心，却没有行为，有什么益处呢？这信心能救他吗？若是弟兄或姐妹赤身露体，又缺了日用的饮食，你们中间有人对他们说：平平安安的去吧，愿你们穿得饱，穿得暖，吃得饱，却不给他们身体所需用的，这有什么益处呢？这样信心若没有行为，就是死的。”
In other words, James is telling us the kind of faith where you can go to church and say you believe in God, and then turn around and live in a different kind of way. That kind of a faith is fake faith. It's not real faith.
所以这里雅各也就是说，如果你是说你对上帝有信心，但是结果却是不一样的，那么这种信心并不是一种真正的信心。
Or as he calls it, dead faith, useless faith.
就像他说的，这种信心就是死的，是没用的信心。
He's not saying we need to work for our salvation. He's saying the things we do, the works we do, show whether or not the faith we say we have is alive.
他是说的，并不是这个信心是假的，而是你有信心没有行为，那么这种信心就是一种假的信心，是一种死的信心。
So when David says, blessed is the one who considers the poor, he's talking about one who has faith in God.
所以当大卫说眷顾贫穷人有福了，那么他是在说这些人，他们在心里面有信心的人。
And because of his faith in God, it changes how he treats his fellow man. He considers those who are in difficulty.
正因为这些人心里面有信心，所以他们心里面的信心会导致他们外在的行为。
But David also does not mean that the one that God preserves never has any trouble or difficulty.
而大卫这里也是说，并不是说有信心的人信靠上面永远就不会有困难。
He says, rather, in the day of trouble, the Lord delivers him.
而他们说的是，只是这些人他们在经历困难的时候，上帝必定搭救他们。
He says that the Lord sustains him on his sickbed.
他是说上帝在他们生病的时候会保全他们。
Meaning that the day of trouble is already here. The illness is already here.
他是说困难的日子就在这里，疾病也就在这里。
And God protects him and sustains him through it.
上帝只在这样情形下面会帮助他们经历这个困苦，经历这个病痛。
So David tells us to ask the question of integrity, how do we treat others?
所以是大卫就问我们心里正直内心的，我们怎么样对待别人？
But perhaps the difficulty you're facing is not your responsibility at all. Perhaps the reason you're suffering difficulty is actually the result of what others have done to you.
所以你现在有这种挣扎的时候，并不是你的信心如何，而是可能别人对你怎么做的。
This is the question of treachery. How do others treat us?
所以这里也就讲到另外一方面，别人怎么背叛你，别人怎么对我们的。
And so in verse 4, David requests mercy from God.
所以在第4节，大卫有向上帝寻求怜悯。
And I find it interesting. He requests mercy even though his circumstances are his fault.
好像很奇怪，说这个时候大卫他在寻求怜悯，他知道他所经历的一切实际上是他自己的行为所造成的，但他是向上帝寻求。
He says, As for me, I said, O Lord, be gracious to me, heal me, for I have sinned against you.
他说耶和华呀，求你怜恤我，医治我，因为我得罪了你。
So I observe a couple things from that.
我们从这里可以看到几个事情。
First, he's confessing his sin here.
首先我们知道他在承认他是一个罪人。
If you want God to listen to your prayers, you must confess your sin.
如果你想让上帝垂听你的祷告，你一定要向上帝承认你是一个罪人。
Now, because salvation is forever, the Christian who sins does not lose their salvation.
因为我们知道这个救赎是永久的，如果是犯罪的人，他不会得到救赎。
But to let unconfessed sin remain in your life is a guarantee that God will ignore your prayers.
如果你有罪，你没有承认，我们知道上帝他不会听你的祷告，他会忽视你的祷告。
Psalm 66:18. If I had cherished iniquity in my heart, the Lord would not have heard me.
在诗篇66章18节。 66章66篇18节讲到，我若心里注重罪孽，主必不听。
And in fact, this isn't the first time David requested mercy when his situation was his fault.
实际上这并不是第一次大卫自己犯了罪，他还是向上帝祈求怜悯。
He also did this after his great sin with Bathsheba.
他在他对拔示巴做了很不好的事情的时候，他也曾经向上帝祈求过怜悯。
The prophet had told him that because of his sin, the child that would be born would die.
这里讲过，因为他做错了事情，所以由这个事情所生的孩子一定会死的。
Which is in fact what happened.
那这个事情也发生了，这个孩子死掉了。
But for the 7 days the child lived, he fasted and prayed every day.
但是在这个孩子在世上存活7天当中，他一直都在进食，而且一直祷告。
So intense were his prayers that his servants were afraid he would harm himself.
实际上在当时他这样祷告的时候，因为他一直没有吃东西，所以他会当时会伤害他自己。
And when the child died, he was afraid, they were afraid that he would be so overwhelmed that he would commit suicide.
所以当小孩7天之后死掉之后，他的所以佣人都很担心，他会更伤心，他会可能会继续不吃饭，然后可能会自杀。
Well, obviously, you can't keep a thing like that secret forever.
当然，你肯定不能永远把这件事情保持秘密。
So eventually, the king finds out.
然后他们就发现，
When he does, he gets up, dresses himself, and goes living like his normal.
结果他们看到大卫那个时候，他就起来开始吃东西，开始回到正常的生活。
Which completely baffled his servants.
然后让他的所有的仆人都很吃惊。
While the child lived, you fasted and prayed and wept before God. Now he's dead and you're going about your business as normal. What's going on?
他们很奇怪，就说你的孩子在生活着的时候，你每天都不吃饭，都进食祷告，很难过。但是现在孩子死掉，你反倒高兴起来，然后开始吃饭，开始恢复正常的生活，到底是怎么一回事？
David explained, while the child lived, I thought maybe God will be merciful to him.
然后大卫就解释，他说这是因为在小孩还活着的时候，我在想，有可能上帝会怜悯我，会原谅我。
So on that chance, he prayed.
所以那个时候他就祷告，上帝救这个孩子。
Once the child was dead, there was nothing more he could do.
但是现在孩子已经死了，我不能做任何事情。
My point, though, is he was praying for mercy even though he knew that this was his fault.
我想讲的这个要点就是说，大卫在祷告，虽然他知道这个事情是他的错，但他依然向上帝祷告。
Of course, this was after he had already confessed his sin to God.
当然，这都是在他承认，他向上帝承认他的罪之后。
So David requests mercy even when it's his fault.
所以大卫他向上帝寻求怜悯，即使他知道是他自己的错。
Now, when he gives us the reason, he spends several verses explaining to us how his enemies treat him.
然后后面有好几个经节，他就讲到原因，他讲到他的仇敌是怎样对待他的。
Now, it reads sort of like someone who is actually suffering from a deadly illness.
我们从这经节可以看到，实际上就像一个人他要经历濒死的症状、疾病一样。
In verse 3, David mentions the righteous man is raised up from his sick bed.
在第3节，他讲到，一人从病床上起来。
And in verse 8, he says that he will not. Let me try that again. In verse 8, David says that his enemies say that he will not rise up again.
在第8节他说，他的敌人说他不能再起来。
So consequently, some scholars think that perhaps David is not talking about his life circumstance at all. As far as we know, David was never sick.
有的人可能就讲大卫并不是讲他自己的情形，因为我们知道大卫他没有生病。
Well, perhaps he wrote this and thought that his life circumstance could apply to someone who was sick.
他写这个，可能他是自己是在想他的这种经历呢，可以有其他人也许有这种经历，并不是他自己有，但他很想其他人。
I mean, a difficulty like this would make just about anyone feel sick, even if they were healthy.
这种情况说，人如果你在经历这种情形的时候，哪怕你是健康的，你可能心里都会感到我已经生了重病。
Well, that's possible, but I tend to think that still that David is describing his own experience.
当然这是有可能的，但是呢，我依然是认为这里大卫是讲他自己经历的。
What he describes is people who come in before him looking like friends but are actually enemies.
这里大卫所讲的是，有一些人看起来好像是朋友，但是实际上他们是他的仇敌。
They come in before him and they utter nice words that sound good, but in reality they're wishing he was dead.
他在讲这里在讲一些人，这些人到他面前来说一些很好听的话，好像很好的话，但是他们心里面却在诅咒大卫的死。
For several years, that's exactly what his son Absalom was doing to him.
在好几年里面，那个是当时押沙龙就是这样做的。
He pretended to be reconciled with his father, but in reality, every day he was going out and trying to subvert his father's authority.
是在听他父亲的话，但他实际上心里面是每天在祈求他可以接近他父亲的儿子。
And slowly, over time, he persuaded the people of Israel that he would make a much better king than his father.
然后逐渐的，他去说服一些以色列人，他告诉他们，他可以成为一个更好的国王，更好的王。
And all that was based on his lies and deceit.
但是这都是基于他撒的谎，他的一些欺骗的行为。
So David knew what it was to be betrayed.
所以上帝，大卫现在所做的事，就是他在被别人欺骗的时候，他所做的事情。
But it seems that really Absalom wasn't the one he's writing about.
但是这里并不是他所写的东西。
It says in verse 9, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me.
他在这个41章第9节讲到，就连我自己的朋友，我所依靠吃过我饭的，也用脚踢我。
That doesn't sound much like Absalom. That sounds a lot like Ahithophel, David's counselor.
这个就像他在讲他的所信任的谋士亚希多弗的亲戚。
As the advisor to the king, Ahithophel would have been on the king's payroll, eating at the king's table.
因为亚希多弗是大卫的谋士，所以当然大卫是给他付薪金，他也吃他的饭。
And his means of rising up against the king was not overt, it was subtle.
所以他这样起来反抗大卫。
He didn't raise an army himself, he merely tried to tell Absalom what the best way to kill David.
他并没有起来直接做，而是他告诉亚沙龙应该怎么样做才能够把大卫杀死。
And so even though David trusted him, turned out he was not someone trustworthy.
所以尽管大卫是很信任他的，但是结果证明他并没有那么信任大卫。
And at this point, we find David's experience being repeated in a greater way in the life of Jesus.
从这里我们也可以看大卫的这个经历，他实际上是有点像耶稣当时所经历的事情一样。
Because it's the same verse that Jesus quotes and applies to himself.
这同样，耶稣也曾经说过，他也有这种经历。
In John chapter 13, Jesus is giving his last supper to his disciples.
在约翰福音第13章，在耶稣吃最后的晚餐的时候，他对他的使徒说。
He is explaining to his disciples that one of them will betray him. He knows who it is, and none of them do.
他对他的使徒说，他知道有一个人会背叛他。
And in this discussion, he says this, I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted up his heel against me. I am telling you this now before it takes place, then when it does take place, you may believe that I am he.
他说我这话不是指着你们众人说的，我知道我所拣选的是谁。现在要应验经上的话，说同我吃饭的人用脚踢我。如今事情还没有成就，我要先告诉你们，叫你们到事情成就的时候，可以信我是基督。
Of course, we recognize he was talking about Judas.
当然，我们知道他在说犹大。
But he doesn't quote the phrase, in whom I trusted, that David said in that same verse.
他在这里就跟刚刚大卫说的一样，他知道他是信任的是谁。
Because Jesus did not trust Judas.
耶稣他并不信任犹大。
There are repeated indications that he knew all along that it would be Judas that would be the one that would turn against him.
在不同的中文，他都暗示过，等他犹大将会是一个背叛他的人。
And when Jesus says, the scripture will be fulfilled, I'm not sure that he means that this is a direct prophecy.
当大卫说会有一个人来背叛他，
Rather, I think he means we see that the experiences of David are repeated in the life of another king, King Jesus.
那么他这里想 想说的是，大卫的经历，他实际上是另外一个王经历的一个重复，就是耶稣。
Both David and Jesus were anointed by God to be kings of Israel.
大卫和耶稣同被主作为以色列的王。
And like so often and like so many other cases, what David experienced in a smaller way, Jesus experienced in a greater way.
如果我们来比较他们两个的生活，大卫所经历的，就是像耶稣所经历的一个小的反应。
Ahithophel may have betrayed David, but it did not lead to David's death.
亚希多弗他可能他是背叛了大卫，但是他并没有直接导致大卫的死亡。
And the only reason it happened is because David didn't see it coming.
因为大卫他没有看到死亡的到来。
When Judas betrayed Jesus, it did result in Jesus' death, and Jesus did see it coming.
但是当犹大他背叛耶稣的时候，耶稣知道他自己会死，而且这个死真的临到他。
And Jesus had given Judas every possible chance to turn back, but Judas did not.
而耶稣曾经给了犹大很多回转的机会，但是犹大都没有使用这些机会来回转。
And so we find his experience being fulfilled or filled out in a greater way.
所以我们可以看到，这里犹大他的经历，就像耶稣的经历一样，只是以不同的程度反应而已。
And we know it's not prophecy because Jesus goes on to explain that he's telling them this ahead of time.
耶稣在圣经里面说的，他在提前已经告诉他们。
In other words, the only way they're going to know that this scripture is being fulfilled in the life of Jesus is because he told them it will be.
所以这个事情会发生，是因为耶稣曾经告诉他们会发生，一定会像这样经历。
After it happens, then they can see the parallels. But before it happens, you need to be a prophet to know that these two events are going to be related.
在发生之前，人们可能不知道；在发生之后，人们才会来比较，就跟他说的是一样的。
Therefore, because Jesus is bringing it up, he's demonstrating that he is in fact a true prophet of God, and therefore is the Messiah he claimed to be.
因为耶稣所说的事，就后来就发生了，所以耶稣通过这种方式来告诉他们，他就是基督。
He says ahead of time, I know whom I've chosen. I knew what Judas was going to do when I chose him, and now I'm telling you what's going to happen.
耶稣他就说，我知道我要选的是谁，我也知道我会发生什么事情。
What happened to David, something similar, only greater, is going to happen to me.
他说，这样大卫所在身上发生的事情，也会发生在我身上，只是说会更大。
So, back in Psalm 41, we find our third question now.
那么我们回到诗篇41篇，讲的第三个问题。
David evaluates his integrity. How do I treat others?
然后大卫自己在反省自己的正直，就是说我怎么样去，上帝怎么样对待我们。
He asks the question of treachery. How do others treat us?
那么刚刚讲到的背叛，别人是怎么对待我们？
And now he asks the question of mercy. How does God treat us?
现在他是寻求怜悯，上帝是怎么对待我们？
And once again, he turns directly to God in verse 10.
在第10节，他又向上帝寻求怜悯。
He says, But you, O Lord, be gracious to me and raise me up that I may repay them.
在第10节当中，他说：“耶和华也求你怜恤我，使我起来，好报复他们。”
He's asking God to restore him to strength so that he can repay his enemies.
他求上帝给他力量，所以他可以去报复他的仇敌。
And here again, we must caution ourselves. We must caution ourselves here.
但是这里我们也要小心一点。
I don't think David is saying that we should pray, God, Raise me up to health so I can get even with my enemies.
这里他并没有说我们应该祷告，所以我们可以一同和我们的仇敌上天堂。
The Christian must never repay evil for evil.
我们是要作为基督徒，我们不能以恶报恶。
Romans 12, verse 17 and following.
在罗马书12章17节。
Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
在罗马书第12章17到21节说：“不要以恶报恶，众人以为美的事，要留心去做。若是能行，总要尽力与众人和睦。亲爱的弟兄，不要自己伸冤，宁可让步，听凭主怒。因为经上记着，主说：伸冤在我，我必报应。你的仇敌若饿了，我就给他吃。” 若渴了，就给他喝，因为你这样行，就是把炭火堆在他的头上。你不可为恶所胜，反要以善胜恶。
Getting even is God's business, so we should leave that to Him.
公平是上帝所做的事情，我们应该让他来决定。
If you are unfortunate enough to have an enemy that hates you as much as David's enemies hated him,
如果你也跟大卫一样，有像大卫的敌人那样恨你的敌人，
then you should do what David did when he found himself able to destroy Saul and didn't.
你应该像大卫所做的事情一样，他最终可以求的力量来战胜仇敌。
On two separate occasions, he could have killed Saul, his enemy who wanted him dead.
曾经有2次的机会，他都可以杀掉他的仇敌以扫。
And in both cases, he refused to do so, even though killing Saul would mean that he could go back to living a normal life.
但是在这2次情形当中，他都拒绝，都没有这么做。即使他知道他杀了他，他可以回到他原来正常的生活当中。
So if you find someone who hates you, and now you have the power and they're begging you for help,
如果你也发现有这么一个人，这些人恨你，但是他也在求你帮助他，
you must not use that opportunity to get even. You must help them.
但是你这个时候不能利用这个机会来报复别人，你应该帮助这个人。
But David is not just an ordinary guy.
但是我知道大卫他并不是一个普通的人，
David is also a king.
他是一个王。
And one of the jobs of the king is enforcing justice.
我们知道作为王，他的其中一项职责也是他要执行公义。
To attempt to kill the king is the classic definition of treachery, treason.
我们知道试图谋杀王是一个叛国的罪。
And in nearly every country, including ancient Israel, treason was punishable by death, and it was the king's job to do it.
我们知道，其实在以色列古代以色列，他们这种罪行都是足以被判死罪的。
So I think David here is requesting strength from God so that he can do what a king is supposed to do, enforce justice.
所以我们知道，实际上这里大卫也是在祈求上帝给他这个力量，所以他可以执行公义。
Paul declares in Romans 13:4 that the government leader is God's servant to avenge God's wrath on the wrongdoer.
所以，在一个圣经里面有提到，那么作为这个政府，他有力量他有责任去惩罚那些作恶的人。
So David is here stating that, or requesting God's mercy to raise him up.
所以大卫他在这里，他可以寻求上帝的帮助，让他有力量，
so that he can do his job of king, which is the job of enforcing justice.
所以他可以行使他作为王的权利来执行公义。
He declares in verses 11 and 12 that he knows that God will be with him.
他在11节和12节当中提到，他知道上帝一定是与他同在。
He says, "By this I know that you delight in me. My enemy will not shout in triumph over me, but you have upheld me because of my integrity and set me in your presence forever."
他说：“因我的仇敌不得向我夸胜，我从此便知道你喜爱我。你因我纯正就扶持我，使我永远站在你的面前。”
In other words, God, when you bring me back in safety, then I will know that is a sign that you are favorable towards me.
另外一个角度来讲，也就是说，当他又回到安全的位置，那么他知道上帝是与他同在。
David also said this during Absalom's revolt.
在押沙龙背叛他的时候，他也曾经说过这个。
As he was fleeing, the priest brought out the ark of God to bring with David, to come along with David.
当他在逃离的时候，他也曾经带了一些士兵跟他。
And he tells the high priest Zadok to carry the ark back into town.
他告诉他们，他会把这些士兵带回城去。
He says, if God wants to be gracious to me, he will bring me back so I'll be able, not only will I come back in safety, but I will be able to worship in the temple again.
他说，如果上帝对我真有怜悯的话，他一定会拯救我，一定会回去来敬拜他。
But if not, if he chooses to let my enemy triumph over me, I'm here. Let God do with me what he feels is best.
他说，但是如果他是旨意是让这些敌人来征讨我，那么我就在这里，他可以做他愿意做的事。
I find it interesting here that David says that he will be upheld because of his integrity.
大卫他在这里说，他一定会被上帝扶持，因为由于他的正直。
And you may wonder, how can David possibly say such a thing when all of these circumstances was ultimately his fault?
你们可能会问，那么大卫他所经历的这些事都是因为他的错，但他怎么可以这么有信心的说这种话呢？
Well, David has already confessed his sin before God.
因为大卫在上帝面前已经承认他的罪。
So while he may be suffering the consequences of his sin, all of that's taken care of.
所以尽管他现在是在承受他的罪所带来的恶果，但是他知道这已经被已经都已经成就了。
So he can claim to be a person of integrity
所以他还是可以做一个艺人，
because he has already confessed his sin.
因为他已经承认了罪。
And while David was hoping for a return in this life, the Christian has an even greater promise.
当大卫在这里在祈求他的生命的回转的时候，我们基督徒也有一个更大的需求。
For him, the sign that God would be with him was that he would come back in safety, which of course we know he did.
对他来讲，他就是祈求上帝让他有回到安全之地。我们也知道他这样做到。
The Christian has a greater promise than this.
对于我们基督徒来讲，我们有祈求更大的应许。
For no matter what happens to us, we are already more than conquerors.
不管是发生什么事情，我们是已经跟耶稣同在。
Now in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him that loved us.
我们知道上帝一定是爱我们。
That's Romans 8:37. And in John 4:4,
在罗马书8章37节和约翰福音4章4节。
he says, "Little children, you are from God and have overcome them, for greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world." 1 John 4:4.
在约翰一书4章4节里面说到。 们呢，你们是属神的，并且胜了他们，因为那在你们里面的，比那在世界上的更大。
See, because we know the conqueror, it doesn't matter what happens to us. We are already more than conquerors. We already triumph.
所以对我们来讲，我们已经知道胜的是我们。
How can you beat someone who has already triumphed over the grave?
你怎么可以打赢一个已经得胜的人呢？
And for the Christian, even the grave cannot defeat us, which means nobody can defeat us.
对于我们基督徒来讲，没有人可以战胜你。
So while David was hoping for a return in this life, we have a greater promise. We are already more than conquerors, and no matter what happens to us, we already know that our enemies will not triumph over us.
对于大卫来讲，那么他希望的是他的安全，他的回转。我们基督来，我们有更大的信心，我们已经取得得胜。
Even if we die, we win all the more, and will join the victorious dead in heaven.
即使我们死亡，我们也会在天堂和上帝同在。
The last question is also the last verse of the psalm.
最后一个问题也是我们这章经节的最后一节。
We asked ourselves, how do we treat others?
我们问我们自己，我们怎么样对待上帝？
How do others treat us?
别人怎么对待我们？
How does God treat us?
上帝怎么对待我们？
And finally, the question of glory, how do we treat God?
最后一个问题就是我们怎么样对待上帝？
Now, this verse doesn't simply end Psalm 41.
这个问题并不在这个诗篇41章就结束。
Verse 13 also ends this section of the Psalms.
第13节是这个诗篇的最后一节。
And you could trace, if we had the time, we could trace through the entire book of Psalms. At the end of every block of Psalms, there's this doxology at the end of it.
如果我们读整个诗篇呢，我们会发现诗篇中很多地方讲到这个同样的话题。
There are 5 such sections in the book of Psalms.
在诗篇当中有5个这样的经节。
In this one, we see, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Amen and amen."
在这里他说，耶和华以色列的神是应当称颂的，从亘古直到永远。阿门，阿门。
Within the context of this psalm, I think we see ultimately where our purpose for living lies.
在这个经节里面，他就讲到我们所希望的永生在哪里。
Our life is not about us.
我们的生命不仅是关于我们自己的，
Ultimately, our life is to bring praise and honor to God.
我们的生命是应该把荣耀和颂赞归给神。
And so in our troubles, we should remember who we are living for.
所以，当我们在经历困苦的时候，我们应该记住，
We are not to
是为
live,
谁而活的。
we are not to live life for ourselves. We are to live it for God.
我们生命不是我们自己而活的，我们是为上帝而活的。
And that helps us to get our eyes off of our problems and onto our Savior.
这样可以让我们不要把眼睛定睛在我们自己困难上面，而是看到我们救主的身上。
So David has given us 4 questions to ask in times of difficulty.
所以这里大卫给了我们4个问题，让我们在我们困苦的时候问我们自己：
Do we have integrity? How do we treat others?
我们有没有一颗正直的心？我们是怎么样对待别人的？
And perhaps the answer to that question is not what you prefer. So then we might ask, how do others treat us?
所以，也许这个问题的答案并不是你所想象的。那么你又要继续问：我们是怎么样对待别人的？别人怎么样对待我们的呢？
And so you can request mercy from God for your problems, whether or not they're your fault.
所以在你有一些困难的时候，不管是你的错，你还是可以向上帝寻求怜悯。
Finally, the question of mercy. How does God treat us?
那么我们讲怜悯的时候，我们
for the Christian, we're already more than conquerors.
对于我们基督徒来说，我们不仅仅是已经得胜，
Nothing can separate us from the love of God.
没有什么可以把我们和上帝的爱分开，
And nothing that happens to us in this life can defeat us.
没有什么在我们生命当中发生的事情可以打败我们。
Because what happens to us is because of God's mercy and God's control, not the result of how we can control life.
所以我们生命当中发生的事情，并不是我们所做的，而是上帝对我们的怜悯，上帝对我们的生命，他是掌控我们生命的。
Finally, the question of glory, who are you living for?
最后我们讲到荣耀的问题，我们活着是为了什么？
In every circumstance of life, be it difficult or joyful, we are to bring glory and honor to God.
在我们生命，不管是我们困难、困苦，还是喜悦的时候，我们都要把我们的赞颂归于上帝。
Perhaps God has brought this circumstance in your life to bring Him more glory.
也许上帝就是把一个情境带入生命当中，让你对他有更多的颂赞。
Let us pray.
让我们一起祷告。
Dear Heavenly Father,
亲爱的天父，
I thank you that you are the God who controls our life.
我们谢谢你，因为你是掌控我们生命的主。
I thank you that you do not deal with us according to what we deserve, but out of your abundant grace and mercy.
我们谢谢你，你对我们生命的领导，是因为你的丰富的爱。
I pray, Lord, that when we are in difficulty, we would evaluate our situation and turn to you for strength and help.
我们感谢上帝，当我们在生命当中遇到困难、困苦的时候，我们可以转向你，寻求你的帮助。
I pray that we would ultimately remember to bring glory to you in every circumstance.
我们祷告，我们最终都会归向你，都会称颂你的大能，称颂你的荣耀。
In Jesus' name.